ahead and say welcome, everyone. So wonderful to have you all here. I am the Reverend Douglas Taylor, serving from our congregation in Binghamton, New York, and I give you good welcome this evening to our session. I'm going to light our chalice and offer you some words as we begin. If you have a candle or a chalice and you wish to do so, I invite you to light it now. I offer these words from my colleague, Susan Milner. Eternal God, Mother and Father, Spirit of life. We are grateful for the companionship of hearts and minds seeking to speak the truth in love. We are grateful for our heritage, for the women and men before us whose prophetic words and deeds make possible our dreams and our insight. We are grateful for the gift of life itself, mindful that to respect life means both to celebrate what it is and to insist on what it can become. May we always rejoice in life and work to cultivate a sense of its giftedness, but may we also heed the call to transformation and growth. May we find in ourselves the strength to face our adversities, the integrity to name them, and the vision to overcome them. May we honor in pride the heroines and heroes of our past, but may we also keep company with the fallen, the broken, and the oppressed, for in the dazzling of noonday's heat and in the star-studded shimmering of night's rich blackness, we are them. Welcome. It is good to have you all here. We are working our way through the text. Well, we're not working our way through it, but we're listening to the author of this wonderful text, Conflagration. John Burens is joining us through this Zoom session to talk with us about the various topics that come up from Transcendentalism. In the promotional materials, the topic for today is about the Transcendentalist, the women who are often forgotten. He has 6 different individuals that he will share their biographies and their impact with us today. So I will hush and invite, actually before I turn it over to John, I'm going to turn it over to AJ, who has just a brief reminder of something that we mentioned last week.
Yes, thank you, Douglas. So this series, this session is graciously being offered to all of you for free of charge, but that does not mean that we don't compensate the wonderful work and labor that is put into it. And it also, we want to build on the excitement and the energy and the collaboration here of all of you all getting together and the ministers of your congregations who've been working together on this. So we want to collect a small collection of free will donations to support this work of living out the legacy of Transcendentalism, this moral revival movement in the 21st century. And so we want to build on this. We want to work towards a regional revival in summer of 2022. So we are asking for donations. We suggest, anywhere in the range of, $10 to $50 for the entire series. You don't have to pay each time, but make one generous donation as you can for having attended one or more of these sessions. I will read this out and put it in the chat as well. Let me get the chat over here. The instructions for giving there in the chat. You can give online at donate.rochesterunitarian.org. Just be sure to, you can put this in the general fund contribution field and just put revival in the notes field, or you can always send us a check to our address, 220 Winton Road South, Rochester, New York, and just put revival in the memo line there. So any offering and generosity you have is greatly appreciated and accepted, and will help us in our efforts to continue the collaboration, have a regional revival, and rest assured that although it is free to you, John Burens will be compensated for his expertise and time and energy. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Am I on now?
It's still looking,
Yes.
there you go. It's you now.
Okay, well, I just told AJ I don't work for less than union scale. But I've also today been working with Sue Redford Campbell, our minister in Brighton, Michigan currently, on building campaigns state by state on one fair wage, especially for women workers in restaurants and other places. So I'll get back to you about that. And if I can do anything to support a cross-congregational revival for Unitarian Universalists in upstate New York, I'm glad to do it. I want to compliment my dear friend Shari Halliday Kwan and AJ for putting together this network to talk about our Transcendentalist forebears, about whom tonight I'm going to focus on the women. Somehow this evening reminds me a little bit about when I went to Concord, Massachusetts in the tour of my book and said, you know, Concord was not the center of the Transcendentalist movement. I thought I'd be run out of town. I said it was downtown, it was in Boston. It was at Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore. And they nodded and they had to agree. Even the docents from Walden Pond. We often misunderstand our Transcendentalist forebears if we think they were just the three individualistic white guys out there in Concord, Emerson, Thoreau, and Alcott. They weren't. Now I'm going to do something and challenge you in New York State. Guess what? The American feminist movement or women's rights movement did not begin at Seneca Falls in 1848. Sorry to tell you that. It began earlier. It began with women closer to Boston. And by the way, after the Civil War, one of the most unjust things that happened in the split of the women's movement over letting Black men vote before white women could was that the New York feminists wrote the Boston feminists out of the story. You can, well, I'm going to provide a bibliography toward the end of this course, but there's a wonderful book on that very subject by a good feminist scholar. So tonight, what I want to do is talk about the real roots of the women's rights movement in America and how people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually benefited from transcendentalists with whom they identified, who had preceded them, and who were often written out of the story, as so often happens with women all the way from biblical times on to the present. I want to start with Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, because she illustrates a way in which we tend to trivialize certain women who we know contributed something by focusing on something that was actually not central to their lives. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody is often credited with being the founder of the American kindergarten movement. Isn't that nice? She was much, much more. She was a fierce intellectual, prodder of men, prodder of her fellow women, a child-centered educator, yes, but also somebody who stood behind Horace Mann and pushed him into the leadership of making free public education a statewide imperative across the Union. Henry James parodied her in his novel, The Bostonians, as Mrs. Birdseye. Because I have to say, reading about Elizabeth Peabody, let's just say that as a good teacher, she hardly ever met a human being she didn't think couldn't be improved. That included William Ellery Channing, for whom she was a voluntary secretary and amanuensis. And she kept prodding Channing to go forward and admit that he was a Unitarian. I still think somebody needs to write a scholarly essay on how it was that Channing stepped forward and first used the term Unitarian at Baltimore in 1819, because it's clear to me that Elizabeth Peabody was a Unitarian before Channing would admit that he was. She was also the first woman or person in America to use the term transcendental in a published essay. Thanks to Channing. She'd heard him when she was only 9, and from him, when she came to Boston to teach children, was given Coleridge's Aids to Reflection to read. That was one of the crucial texts for a lot of our Transcendentalist forebears. It made the distinction between understanding the input that we get through our senses, the empirical learning, and reason, which is in the vocabulary of our Transcendentalist forebears, that transcendent faculty that we're all endowed with that allows us to make moral and spiritual intuitive judgment. We know that we're not the sum and substance of the universe, nor are all of its parts. There is a whole, a soul of the universe that needs to be attended to. We know that my moral responsibility is not just not to cheat people. It's to be concerned for your full moral, spiritual development as a human being, because it depends, my own spiritual development depends on my concern for yours. Peabody worked with Bronson Alcott in his innovative child-centered school at the Temple in downtown Boston. She also lived at a boarding house run by the mother of the thread figure through my narrative, Rebecca Clark, mother of James Freeman Clark, ran a boarding house where Elizabeth and Mary Peabody lived at the same time that Horace Mann was there. Horace Mann had just lost his wife to tuberculosis, which was endemic in the time. And Elizabeth, who thought that it was her duty to help people through their spiritual difficulties, latched onto him, but so did her sister. Her sister would sing to him, Elizabeth would read with him. Megan Marshall, in her brilliant book, The Peabody Sisters, shows that Elizabeth, who had reason in her family system to be wary of men, as not reliable, sometimes abusive, actually became engaged secretly to Horace Mann, and then realized that Mary was more interested in him than she was. And Mary Peabody and Horace Mann married after this incredible story. Elizabeth Peabody took Horace Mann to hear William Ellery Channing preach on Easter. Why? Because Mann was almost paralyzed by the loss of his first wife, Charlotte. And Channing that Sunday preached a Transcendentalist Easter sermon about 2 losses in his own family, both of women. Elizabeth looked across the church and wondered whether this would get through to Horace Mann, and he was weeping and clearly transformed. She took him to meet with Dr. Channing, who knew that Horace Mann, who was then the president of the state Senate in Massachusetts, had been interested in reform causes, but had grown up in a town where the school was available only for 6 weeks in the winter because the children were needed in the fields at other times. And Channing helped Horace Mann realize that his real vocation was promoting better opportunities for education for poor children like himself. And he became, after he resigned from the state Senate and gave up the opportunity to be either a United States Senator or the governor of Massachusetts, the first superintendent of public education in the United States, and to encourage every other state in the Union. Frankly, just in time before more immigration, to provide free public education for every child, regardless of their family's means or background. Talk about transformative. But Elizabeth gets forgotten behind Horace and others like Channing. By the way, the last meeting of the Transcendentalist Circle, 1836 to 1840, was held at Elizabeth's home, 13 West Street in Boston. I worked with Megan Marshall on making it a historical site. It's been a building with a lot of failed restaurants, frankly, over the years. That's where she published the Dial. That's where she helped Margaret Fuller, who became the editor of the Dial, hold her famous and transformative Conversations for Women. It's where she promoted Brook Farm and its school, where Margaret's brother was one of the students. If you follow the narrative in my own book, you'll see how it was Elizabeth Palmer Peabody who was outraged at the treatment of William Ellery Channing when he was denied the opportunity to hold a memorial service for Charles Follen, his own parishioner and representative to the anti-slavery movement. And it was at 13 West Street that the Church of the Disciples, the first Transcendentalist congregation in Boston, was actually organized, with the Peabody and Channing families as absolutely key to it. Well, I could say more about her or any of these women. Again, I'm going to provide you with a bibliography. Let me turn to Margaret Fuller, whom Elizabeth helped start her Conversations for Women. They were both among the most educated women of their time, but when there were no colleges in the entire United States that were open to women. They had some supports, Margaret particularly. Her father was a congressman. He would write home to her mother from Washington. Tell little Margaret I love her if she learns her Latin. Margaret was 6. By 8, she was reciting Virgil from memory to her father. And by 20, she was facing down the young Harvard students who couldn't get in unless they knew Latin and Greek, that she knew it better than they. And by the way, she was reading more contemporary literature, partly provided by Elizabeth Peabody. There's a new film out, by the way, that the UU Studies Network, which I co-chair, is going to make available to congregations. It's a 40-minute documentary about Margaret Fuller. I really recommend it. It's free to congregations. Well, at 20, she was studying German, Goethe, with James Freeman Clarke. I think I'm the first person to have ever published even an excerpt from James Freeman Clarke's journal of that period, where he does what's we learned in clinical pastoral education as kind of a verbatim of their interactions. It begins, J, I hesitate to come to you when I have no fresh ideas to share. M, what makes you think I'm interested in your ideas? It's clear that they were almost flirtatious at 20, but quickly understood that Margaret would make a lousy minister's spouse in the 1830s, and that that's where James should be headed. He, in fact, became the first Unitarian minister west of the Appalachians in Louisville, Kentucky in 1833. They had a lifelong spiritual friendship that is utterly remarkable, because he published her first essays and encouraged her as a critic and a writer. And she wrote back to him when he said that he'd failed as an extemporary preacher with no notes in front of him. And the energy just drained out his fingers. She said, here's a few outlines of sermons that you might try. The Conversations for Women included Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the last session. Seneca Falls never would have occurred without Margaret behind it, and everybody knew it back then. By 1848, the time of Seneca Falls, she was no longer in the United States. She was in Europe. She was covering the revolutions going on in that time for Horace Greeley's, remember, Greeley's a Universalist, for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. By the way, his other European correspondent was a gentleman named Karl Marx. Horace Greeley was a gutsy guy, although a little ascetic. Margaret hated living at their home when she was in New York because they lived on the Graham diet, which made veganism look sort of indulgent. And she was out there doing things like interviewing the women at Sing Sing who had been imprisoned for trying to survive by prostituting their own bodies, and asking why. In Europe, she encountered Giuseppe Mazzini, the radical founder of Italian nationalism, and Mickiewicz, the national poet and romantic leader of the Polish nationalist movement, who suggested to her that perhaps at 38, it was time that she give up being a virgin. It's not clear whether that happened in Paris, but it certainly did in Rome, where she met a young Italian named Giuseppe Orsini on, I love this, on Good Friday evening services at the Vatican, and became his lover and the mother of his child. Whether they were ever legally married is not entirely clear. what is clear is that in her attempt to return to America in 1850 with her husband and baby, all three died in the tragic foundering of the brig Elizabeth at the entrance to New York Harbor. James Truman Clark and Emerson and Henry Channing, William Ellery's nephew, sent Thoreau down there to see if anything could be salvaged, like her proposed book about the 1848 revolutions in Europe. All they could come up with was the body of the baby, which is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery under a monument dedicated to Margaret and Orsini, Ossoly, excuse me, Ossoly. Orsini is a more noble name than Roman history, Ossoly. She was expected to preside over the 1850 second meeting of the Women's Rights Convention in Worcester. She never got the letter. The great biography of Margaret Fuller and the film are really worthy of our attention because they clearly show how important she was before Seneca Falls to getting women to think for themselves. Her dialogues with women were all about, well, if you consider the Greek myth of Psyche and Eros that your husbands learned when they were studying Greek at Harvard, what do you think about the passive role of Psyche? Don't get me going. Margaret was a force. But even before her, older than her, and older than Elizabeth even by a couple of years, was Lydia Maria Child, who is now almost completely forgotten and trivialized. I mean, if anybody knows anything about her, it's that she wrote that little ditty, "Over the river and through the woods, to grandfather's house we go." Nobody remembers that in 1824, before her brother presided over the first meetings of the Transcendentalist circle, her brother was Converse Francis, the oldest member of the original Transcendentalist circle. She wrote the only novel of that era that treated Native Americans with dignity and not as something to be forgotten and left in the past, which has been the primary way in which white America has treated Native Americans for centuries now. Hobomok, 1824. This is the same era as The Last of the Mohicans. And Hobomok is a novel in which the principal character of that name, a Native American, is not only active on behalf of his own people. The plot resolves, catch this, with his marrying a white woman. Imagine the scandal that Lydia Maria Child took on in publishing that book. She married David Child, who was a quixotic lawyer, co-founder of the Anti-Slavery Society with William Henry Garrison. She became the editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard and was called by Garrison himself the first woman of the Republic. Now, here I'm challenging another legend about these women, that the women's rights movement comes out of abolitionism. I want to tell you that I think some women led the abolitionist movement. Not only people like Lydia Maria Child, before it organized, but also women in places like Concord. I mentioned last week, I think, that Thoreau's aunts were members of the Women's Anti-Slavery Society of Concord before, well, I'll get into that next week, because that's when we're going to talk about the Transcendentalists and abolitionism, anti-slavery, and what they have to say to us still today. If you want a really forgotten woman, though, turn to my favorite, Caroline Healey Dall. She was the youngest member of Margaret Fuller's Conversations. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody had to tell both her and Ralph Waldo Emerson occasionally to shut up and let Margaret do what she was trying to do. Like Fuller, she was the eldest child of a man of privilege. Her father was a banker. Her mother was, as any woman in that era in a certain social status, had the right to be deeply and chronically depressed. And so she took on a kind of leadership role among her siblings and even in her church, a Unitarian church in the West End of Boston, where one of the Transcendentalists, Cyrus Bartol, helped her become acquainted with the situation of the impoverished. Then her father became one. He went bankrupt in the Panic of 1837. Suitors who were clustered around her fled. She had to teach. And while she was in Washington, D.C., she met Charles Henry Appleton Dall, who was the minister to the poor in Washington, and married him against her better instincts. And indeed, Dall was a limited man. He might have been interested in the poor, but he couldn't organize the kind of ministries that would be really effective or raise money for them. And he failed time after time. He couldn't connect with congregants. I once served the first parish in Needham, Massachusetts, where Dall became finally the minister. It was an impoverished little farm town outside Boston. Caroline gave birth to a stillborn child. The senior deacon of the parish, which was then not divided between Unitarians and Trinitarians, was an unreconstructed Calvinist who interpreted the stillbirth as a judgment of God against the advanced thinking of the minister and his wife. She had published a book at the age of 22 called Sketches and Essays, which included a screed against the Mexican War, one on behalf of immediate abolitionism, and the third one entitled Sisterhood. Let's just say the farm women in Needham, Massachusetts did not know what to do with Caroline Healey Dall. And after a while, neither did her husband, who came home to her a few years later, announcing that he was taking off to be the Unitarian minister in Calcutta. They never married, never divorced. Caroline's biographer, Helen Deese, calls this a Boston divorce. But he came home only a few times for family events. He sent a little bit of his stipend. And she became the author of 22 books and the founder of the American Social Science Association. She was the only woman who dared take on people like Elizabeth Peabody and say, you know, I think we need to talk about domestic abuse. The economic issues behind prostitution. The realities being faced by women in America who are excluded from any decent way of earning a living that isn't subordinated. Some of her books chronicled the slow opening of the professions and the colleges to women. When the women's clubs of America were organized after the Civil War, Caroline was rather shocked to be blackballed. She asked Thomas Wentworth Higginson, "What do they have against me?" And he had to reply, "I can only say they simply do not like you, Mrs. Dall." She was telling her women friends things they did not want to deal with or hear. She ended up in the latter part of her life living in Washington, where she was a part of a salon that included Grover Cleveland's wife, and where her son, who was an early explorer of Alaska, was the hub around which she revolved. By the way, those women's clubs after the Civil War, heavily organized around and by Julia Ward Howe, who should never be remembered just for the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Although I tell the story of how it came about, because both Dall and Howe were members of James Freeman Clarke's congregation of the Church of the Disciples in Boston. And it had to do with Julia's husband having supported John Brown. They're down in Washington during the height of the Civil War. They're hearing a regiment march past singing the John Brown song. James Freeman Clarke turns to Julia Ward Howe and says, "That song must be uncomfortable for you." Indeed it was. Her husband, how can I put it, was both a noble romantic reformer who founded the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston. But Samuel Gridley Howe was also an unreconstructed misogynist. The best biography of Julia is one called The Civil Wars of Julia Ward Howe. He had had to flee to Canada for fear of being tried for treason after John Brown was hung. And James Freeman Clarke says to Julia, "The soldiers clearly like that tune. It's a pity it doesn't have better words." And that night at the Willard Hotel in Washington, with her latest baby, she had 6, asleep in a cradle, Julia got up in the middle of the night and penned the immortal words, "Mine eyes have seen the glory." Because she had a faith beyond the horizon that anyone could see in a redemptive outcome of the bloodiest war in American history. You can't read that hymn as militaristic so much as a prayer for redemption. By the way, she has recently been discovered to have published to have written an unpublished novel called The Hermaphrodite, which was her attempt in the middle of the 19th century to say that within every woman there is something that is now confined to the male gender trying to come out. And by the way, something of the female in every worthy man trying to come out. Let me turn then to Emily Dickinson, because she is almost always regarded outside the Transcendentalist circle. And yet, if you read her biographies, you see that she didn't start to write poetry until a friend, a disciple of her, lawyer father, gave her a copy of Emerson's poems. She had quit the more orthodox Calvinist female seminary that was later Mount Holyoke, because she would not stand up and say that I hope to be saved. In the middle of the beginning of this, no, right at the beginning of the Civil War, the radical Unitarian Transcendentalist minister Thomas Wentworth Higginson wrote a piece in the newly issued magazine, The Atlantic, as advice to young contributors. And Emily sent him some poems, asking if they were worthy. And he was blown away, as well he might have been. She probably never would have reached much of a public without Thomas Wentworth Higginson. But his story, whew, I encourage you to read it in my book or in the book by oh my gosh, I'm gonna block on her first name, Brenda Wineapple, called White Heat, the friendship, the spiritual friendship between Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Emily Dickinson. But by the way, talk about trivialization. She was not the belle of Amherst. And her best biographers these days finally have figured out why it was that she was reclusive. She almost certainly had light sensitive epilepsy, which was regarded in that era as the falling disease that was a scandal because you were out of control. And so she wrote by night and stayed reclusive by day. And it is a drama, but not the one we're usually told. And I'm going to end here with not only her words, there are 1,200 of them, you know, and they are Transcendentalist poems. Perhaps the one best known is "Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me. The carriage held but just ourselves, and immortality." Thomas Wentworth Higginson met her only twice face to face, but the power of that friendship led him to come and make his third visit to her in Amherst for the funeral held in the parlor that you can still visit there, where he read these words from the English poet Emily Bronte. I offer these as tribute to all of these 6 women I've touched on this evening, because they fit them all. No coward soul is mine, no trembler in the world's storm-tossed sphere. I see heaven's glories shine, and faith shines equal, arming me from fear. O God within my breast, almighty ever-present deity, life that in me hath rest, as I undying life have power in thee. Vain are the 1,000 creeds that move men's hearts, unutterably vain, worthless as withered weeds or idlest froth among the boundless main. To waken doubt in one holding so fast in thy infinity, so surely anchored on the steadfast rock of immortality. With wide embracing love, thy spirit animates eternal years, pervades and broods above, changes, sustains, dissolves, creates, and rears. Though earth and moon were gone, and suns and universes ceased to be, and thou wert left alone, every existence would exist in thee. There is not room for death, nor atom that his might could render void, since thou art being and breath, and what thou art may never be destroyed. May the heritage of these great transcendentalist women, their courage and spirituality, known or unknown, remembered or forgotten, be recalled as our legacy, their immortality, and our inspiration. Thus endeth the sermon. Doug, back to you, I think.
That sounds fair enough. Thank you, John. This has been quite informative. Thank you so much. So we're going to open this up for all of you who are here now to engage with this material and engage with John. Ask any questions. I'm going to recommend 2 really good ways to bring a question to the group. One is to find the chat function there on the bottom of your Zoom screen and write it in. The other is there's a way to raise your hand, which if you literally just wave your hand, I won't see you. I'm not that good. And there's about 100 of us here. So there's a button called reaction, and you can find there a little piece that says raise hand, and you can put your hand up there. And what that does is it bumps your screen up to the top so I can see it. So while I'm waiting for you to ponder questions that you might ask, I'm going to go ahead and offer one right here at the top, John, if I may. The piece that I heard during these 45 minutes or so is the history, some of the biography, and how amazing these women were in their time and indeed still are today when we look at them. Is there something in particular about Transcendentalism that created this culture in which women could be encouraged this way? Is there something in particular about Transcendentalism that opened this up?
Well, as I said last week, it goes back to the term transcendental, which Elizabeth Peabody was the first person to use in English in America. Goes back to Kant, to the transcendental categories that shape our thinking about even empirical input. And in particularly around moral and spiritual issues. Those are transcendent categories that ultimately lead to things that are more intuitive than empirically provable. That is, we can argue forever about the existence of God or no God, depending on what your image is. But the fact that we're miraculously here in a universe not of our making is beyond dispute. That's a transcendent truth. So is the fact that if I don't care about you, my moral breadth is diminished. If you want to grow a soul, you have to care about other people. Those are the two dimensions of the Transcendentalist ethos that made them concerned not only for the political immediacy of fighting against Native American dispossession, and they did protest the Cherokee removal, by the way, although we'll talk about the limits of their imagination on that subject next week. And not only about, abolishing slavery, they felt that women were being left behind. And they had daughters and sisters and wives. By the way, the wives of the privileged of Boston were the largest part of that flock that came to Margaret Fuller's conversations. So, yes, they cared about the full flourishing of other human souls. And that was a new insight, because the previous generation had felt that everything was transactional. And by the way, we're back in another era where we think everything is transactional. Oh, there's a contract, a marriage contract, an ownership contract. I've just sold you Henrietta. The Transcendentalists would not put up with that. They believed in, and we'll get to this again next week, a higher law that was higher than the law of contracts and transactions, a moral law, a spiritual imperative, a categorical imperative, that we treat one another as moral agents, spiritual beings, whose full flourishing is tied up with our own. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, John. There's a couple of comments in the chat. The first one here from Faith Most. I recently read both books by Megan Marshall and was blown away by that. Growing up in Massachusetts, I was never taught about them. I look forward to learning more about the others you mentioned.
Yeah. So let me just mention, Megan is a great friend. She and I worked together on making 13 West Street a landmark. She and I are working together on promoting this film about Margaret Fuller. What else can I say about her? Oh, God, what a scholar. What a fine biographer. So much of what I've written is dependent upon secondary sources. I am not a big archivist. There are a few original discoveries in my book, like my discovery of James Freeman Clarke's journal about his early studies of Goethe with Margaret Fuller, and Frederick Douglass's work to build the monument over Theodore Parker's grave in Florence. But no, Megan is a fabulous scholar, and I commend both of her books. Somebody's just popped up and found one of the typos in the first edition of my book, which suggests that Theodore Parker lived to be 150. because I got instead of his death date at 1860, it says 1960. Well, thank you for that. All authors try to get their details right. I'm now in the middle of doing yet another book where I'm hiring a second proofreader to work on it. All right, let's see.
Well, let me direct your attention toward a question that came from Teresa Ramsey. The statement about every woman having a man within that wanted to be honored and every man having a woman within that wanted to be honored, paraphrased, sounds very Jungian. And do you know if Carl Jung was influenced by these writings? Who was the author who talked about that?
I don't think he was familiar with them at all. I'm not a great Jung scholar, but I would say that Margaret Fuller, in many ways, anticipated his kind of reinterpretation of some of the classical myths. I think the most brilliant thing she did with these women was to start with the myth of Psyche and Eros, or Cupid, which leaves all of the initiative in mutual attraction in the male figure, and Psyche is passive. And for Margaret to ask women in 1839 if they were comfortable with that, and whether they felt that they didn't have some agency, it was just transformative. I just saw another remark from Monica Beck here saying it's interesting how we don't learn the full history of our country. Well, and when it comes to the Transcendentalists, the big problem is that we learn about them in literature classes as though the only people who mattered were the writers who became famous. Emerson, Thoreau. And not, well, sometimes Margaret Fuller is included. Although I'll tell you, she's not easy to read. Her book, Woman in the 19th Century, is absolutely brilliant and clearly one of the founding documents of American feminism. But for a contemporary reader, it's a pain because she's trying to prove that she's as well educated as the guys are. And so it is loaded with references to Greek and Latin mythology that kind of leave most of us these days kind of, huh? And so one should never think that this is all external. Sometimes people coming out of oppressed categories buy into certain things that marginalize themselves. I see Monica nodding as though she gets it, that that's what can go on.
Like, by the way, Katie Stanton staying at home with the children, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Sure. She stayed at home in Seneca Falls with the children.
Right. Yeah, and she said some of the most foul, racist things you can imagine in response to the 15th Amendment to the Constitution after the Civil War. We don't need to treat any of these people as though they were little tin saints or people of perfection. They weren't, neither are we. But do we have things to learn from them? Oh my God. Particularly in some of the persistence and the self-examination that they were willing to go through. The way they maintained spiritual friendships that transcended their own sphere of comfort. so I could go on with all of that. I just have posted, I think, in the, I hope, if I can just figure out how to do this. There. That is the document that summarizes my remarks for this evening. So you can go back to that. And I hope you know that the church in Rochester has posted last week's session, which was the first one, about the Transcendentalists and about my thoughts on how their spiritual disciplines remain relevant to us today. That's on their YouTube channel and open to anyone. Next week, by the way, what I'm going to be doing in this session, it focuses on their work in the anti-slavery movement, which I also think is badly misunderstood in, oops, says the link may be broken. Well, let's see. Yeah. All right. I'll do my best to, I wonder if the edit at the end is the part that's the problem. I'll do my best to get that up there. I'm just learning how to take a document that I've created in Word, put it up on a Google Drive, and then copy it in. If it isn't in the chat tonight, we'll work on it and make sure that this week's summary is in the chat next week.
All right, sounds good. I think that our commitment is to go for a while longer, but it feels like we're coming to a conclusion point. There's not a whole lot of new questions popping up in the chat. I think this has just been some phenomenal. Oh, I see a hand that's popped up. A couple of hands. Oh, thank you, beloved people. I'm going to say that I see Greg Garvey with a hand raised over there. And then after that, I see Reverend Lynn. But let's start with Greg.
Hi, I wonder what kind of relationships did the Transcendentalist women's circle, particularly the Boston Elizabeth Peabody circle, have with the Quaker women who were also so deeply active in reform, you know, like Angelina Grimke or Lucretia Mott.
Yeah, thank you for that, Greg. There is, you know, one of the things I tried to do in my book was to say that the center was not conquered, it was more urban. But the fact of the matter is that there were multiple urban centers, principally the biggest cities of the Northeast at the time: Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Now, I have one chapter in the book, which I'm sure is going to go down hard with some of my friends who are friends. It's a chapter that begins with some insights by a Quaker sociologist who says that if you compare Quaker Philadelphia with Puritan, later Unitarian, Boston, one of the problems among the Quakers was that they couldn't act on things unless they had a consensus in the meeting. And their standards for egalitarian treatment were sort of limited within among friends. So they never really, in most meetings, could come to a consensus about a strategy for countering slavery. One of the things that's really interesting in this period is how many, particularly women, like Susan B. Anthony, left the Quakers to become Unitarians because they were sick of waiting for the Quaker meeting to come out with a stance against slavery. Now, that isn't to say that there weren't courageous Quaker women. Lucretia Mott, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's partner in organizing the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The Grimke sisters, who did not grow up Quaker, but converted to Quakerism out of their experience of being slave owners in Charleston, South Carolina, and who challenged the convention of the early 19th century that women should not speak in public. And we're still very biblically literalistic. Women should keep silence in church. And the Grimkes often spoke in Unitarian circles up and down New England and the Northeast, and broke that that tie. But the anti-slavery movement split over whether women could be officers of the anti-slavery movement and public speakers on its behalf. So yes, Quaker women were an important part of the background to the anti-slavery movement. But one of the things that I'm trying to say here, and the reason I put the women's movement ahead of the anti-slavery movement and not vice versa, is that all too often, the women's rights movement, if it is dated from 1848, is seen as an offshoot of abolitionism, which starts in the 1830s. And the background of women actually pushing the anti-slavery movement is lost. I hope that's clear in what I've said tonight.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move along to notice another hand that is raised, Reverend Lynn Gardner.
Oh, Glenn, how great that you're here.
Hello, good to see you. Thank you for this. One sort of comment and a question. My comment comes as a person who studied early childhood education and human development and worked with families and young children prior to going to seminary. I'm going to put in a plug for kindergarten.
Yeah.
And that Elizabeth Peabody being the founder of kindergarten may be a sweet thing, but dang, I am so grateful that she had a vision that children needed the chance to play, and that learning happens through play. So that's just a plug for kindergarten and that important work.
Can I jump in for just a second there, Lynn? Yeah, what bothers me is that it was sort of a late life project for her. It's after the Civil War. After wars, traditional gender roles tend to get reinforced. We saw that after World War II. My parents' generation, women were staying home and men were going to be the breadwinners and so forth. Elizabeth and many of the other women in Transcendentalist circles found their roles more circumscribed after the Civil War. The high watermark of transformation was actually, and of Unitarian influence, was actually during the Civil War and in the run-up to it. So what I just object to is the way in which that's regarded as her only contribution, and they don't go way back and see what a transformative effect she had on men.
Yeah, she did. They were just little at the time.
No, I mean,
yeah. They were only 5 when she had a lot of impact on them.
Yeah, she worked with Bronson Alcott in this incredible school in Boston.
Yeah,
it was really, I think, the first experiment in real child-centered education. The kids were not lined up in rows. The open space in the middle of the classroom was for dance and play. And they, had little learning centers around the room. That's partly Elizabeth and partly Bronson. I think she was more practical than he was. Last week, I think I talked about Bronson Alcott's daughter's send-up of his idealism in the little book called Transcendental Wild Oats, which was about why their short-lived utopian community at Harvard, Massachusetts.
Yes, thank you. I did want to ask, do you happen to know was there any response to Lydia Maria Child's book from Native American individuals and or communities? I realize that some people who were white were not happy with it, but I'm just wondering what the response was from the indigenous communities.
I think the sad truth, Lynn, is that there were almost no readers among indigenous people at the time. And so Hobomok, as far as being perceived by any Native Americans as the expression of an ally, just dropped into a void. There may have been a few. I'm not enough of a scholar of early Native American, early 19th century Native American people to know whether there was any response at all, but I actually think it was small or minimal, and that's sad. Ideally, when people from privilege come into a relationship with people who are clearly being oppressed, the only thing that will work is to really be acknowledged by the oppressed as an effective ally and an additional voice. I had that experience myself after I was done being president of the UUA, spending 10 years as national co-chair of Freedom to Marry. At the beginning, I was the only non-gay person in the room. And I kept saying, I think maybe my role here is to show you that you have other allies. I wish that Lydia Maria Child had been in a position to say to, well, God knows there were literate Native Americans, the Cherokee. Although that crisis for them comes almost a decade after she wrote Hobomok. And the other truth about Lydia Maria Child's social situation was that she was constantly having to write, partly to earn a living. The reason she's remembered for Over the River and Through the Woods is for a while she wrote the first children's magazine in America called the Juvenile Miscellany. And she was grinding out The Frugal Housewife, which was probably her most successful publication, just to earn a little money, because her husband was, as an anti-slavery advocate, constantly being sued for libel or, they had a tough marriage. By the way, one of the chapters in my book is called Marriage in the 19th Century, which was not exactly a piece of cake for the women partners. It was an era when women couldn't go to school beyond a certain level, when at the beginning they didn't have property rights, when divorce began to be recognized as an appropriate solution to abuse. You got counter reactions. Here, upstate New York, the origins of Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints are directly tied to the assertion of women for the right to be divorced. And the response in this revelation from on high is men should be allowed to have multiple wives. Yeah, thank you, AJ. You just posted the name of the book, Conflagration, All Sales Are Welcome. Lynn, did that solve any of your query?
Yeah, I was just sort of curious if there was any response.
I don't think so.
Whether it was then or even now, if there's if there are folks who are saying,
we're beginning to develop their own alphabet, their own publications, and then Andrew Jackson comes in and deports all of the remaining Native Americans of the American Southeast that he can find to Indian territory, to what later becomes Oklahoma. Emerson organizes a protest against the Cherokee removal, the Trail of Tears. But I have to say, and this is a prelude to next week, if there's one thing that really struck me as sad out of this whole period, it's how resigned most white Americans were to the disappearance of Native Americans. It's like residual Calvinism. They almost felt that, well, it's predestined. And that's true even of a lot of the most enlightened. You see parts of that in Thoreau, in Walden, nostalgia about the Native Americans who used to be there, but no real response. And I could go on. Yeah. So their anti-racism was always somewhat limited, particularly around the displacement of the indigenous. Doug, anybody else?
Well, John, I'm looking around and I think we've
beaten them
through all of the hands that had been raised. And I think what I'm seeing in the chat is a lot of appreciation about the book, and so, but not specific questions. There had been a question earlier about not related to women, but a recommendation for a biography on Clark.
On Clark?
Yeah, Martin.
Oh, well, that actually allows me to say a word about what's been going on with, I use in the book an epigraph from Emerson from his essay on history. There is no history. There is only biography. But the only biography of James Freeman Clarke, and this book actually started out to maybe be a biography of him. He's the thread figure, but I decided it shouldn't be just about him. It was about his friendships, his interactions with this broad range of people. I mean, he does Emerson's funeral, for God's sake. He does Hawthorne's funeral. He's key to Julia Ward Howe and to Caroline Healey Dall and to Margaret Fuller, and go on and on. Theodore Parker never would have gotten a hearing in Boston without James Freeman Clarke. But the only biography that was written of him was by a man named Bolster in the early 1950s, published by Beacon Press. And he did write an autobiography in the 1880s. Thank you, Sam. But the way people did biography in the 1880s was that they would, and I hate this, they outline a person's life, rifle through their letters and journals, excerpt them to tell whatever meta-narrative they thought was important, and throw the rest away. Frothingham did this for William Henry Channing, who is the transcendentalist that today I think is most deserving of a fresh 21st century biography. Channing's nephew. Christian socialist. Radical in many respects. Hard to do because he was both here in America and in England for long stretches of his time. He's the Civil War minister in Washington, D.C. I think maybe I've found somebody who'll do that biography. But in the 1950s, when Bolster was writing his biography of Clark, the trend in biography was to tell an uplifting story, whether it was grounded in much archival research or not. So the epitome of this is a book, the original book called The Peabody Sisters of Salem, by a woman author, shouldn't be entirely despised for her work, but she literally took the three Peabody sisters, Elizabeth, Mary, and Sophia, who marries Nathaniel Hawthorne, and treats them like the three women in Little Women. They all have to fit a stereotypical role in the family. Oh, the youngest is the artist, and the eldest is the author, and the middle one is the teacher. Certain amount of truth in that, but it was not carefully researched, and it just distorted the story that Meghan Marshall had to come behind and unwind. So one of the things that I was very aware of was I was coming into a new era of doing biographies of these people, much better biographies. I wasn't going to redo them, but I was going to depend upon the Meghan Marshalls and others. Now, not all of their biographies are all that readable, these new, very scholarly ones. I wish the Dickens that Lydia Maria Child, for example, would get a biographer who would be a little bit more accessible than the very scholarly but somewhat inaccessible work of Caroline Karcher. So I try to write in the space between popularization and scholarship. And that's where my book lands. I want people to go and read more from what I've done with trying to lift up these lives that were so important and should be reread and re-understood.
So there's, we've got about 5 minutes left, but there's one more hand that's just come up. I see Bernard Gage, if you'd like to unmute and chime in.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for mentioning Hawthorne. I knew that he had married one of
Sophia Peabody, yeah.
In Blaisdell Romance, there is a reference to a very obese matron, and I was wondering if he was making fun of one of the Peabody sisters when he did that.
I don't think that particular reference is not to Elizabeth, but to another woman who was part of the Brook Farm community. And of course, Hawthorne went off to Brook Farm with the rather naive notion. Well, I think he was motivated mostly by trying to get away from his mother, but he went to Brook Farm thinking that if he invested some money that he had earned there, he might get a return on the money and write another book or two. And he found that being at Brook Farm and having to actually muck out the cow stable at the beginning of the day was not conducive to writing a story in the afternoon.
Right.
And he left within 6 months. He also, like Melville, is a product of Transcendentalism and a critic of Transcendentalism's excesses. In particular, he didn't like the somewhat naive notions that are lifted up occasionally by people like Emerson, that everybody is at heart really quite good and cooperative.
That would be hard.
That was not Hawthorne's experience, and it was not Melville's experience. And they were interesting critics of Transcendentalism from within Transcendentalism.
Okay. I'm seeing the time and noting that we've got just a few minutes left. There's some commentary in here in the chat about biographies of Margaret Fuller.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if you want to offer a quick comment there.
Yeah, certainly Megan Marshall's biography of Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, is the best thing that's been done about her. I will next week post in the chat when I can figure out how to do the notes from this week, the reference to the documentary about Margaret Fuller, which is going to be shown at our General Assembly, I hope, in Portland in June, and then made available to congregations. The producer is a fellow named Peter Riley from our congregation in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's a CPA. He's done a fabulous job with it. And Megan Marshall is one of the key people who speaks about Margaret in the documentary.
All right. Thank you, John. Well, we're coming around to the end of our time, and I just want to offer on behalf of all of us here our appreciation, John, for the time that you have spent with us and for the ways that you've pulled some of these threads together and offered them to us. Thank you so much. What a gift.
Next week, anti-racism and anti-slavery.
All right. Blessings to all of you on your way. Thank you for being here with us. Go well into the evening.
You too.